Everything started falling apart in Shanghai, and the season had barely begun. 2 races. That is all it took for the brand new 2026 Formula One rules to trigger chaos across the entire grid. Max Verstappen retired. Fernando Alonso retired. 2 McLaren cars never even made it to the starting grid. And suddenly drivers across Formula One began questioning the very rules that were supposed to make the sport better. Because the FIA promised something huge with these regulations. Closer racing. Smarter aerodynamics. A revolutionary hybrid system designed to define the future of Formula One. But the Chinese Grand Prix revealed something very different. Electrical failures. Cars vibrating uncontrollably. Teams struggling just to keep their machines alive until the finish line. And one detail that may explain why several drivers, including Verstappen, are already furious. Because while half the grid was fighting chaos, one team looked completely untouchable. Mercedes. A dominant 1-2 finish. A car that seemed to understand the new rules better than anyone else. Which raises a very uncomfortable question inside the paddock. Did the FIA accidentally create a rulebook that only a few teams truly understand? If that is true, the competitive balance of Formula One could change dramatically, only 2 races into the season. Drivers are already frustrated. Engineers are quietly worried. And after what we saw in China, the controversy around these new regulations may only be beginning. But there is one detail from that race that most fans completely missed. A technical change hidden inside the 2026 rulebook that may explain the chaos, the retirements, and why Verstappen's frustration could just be the beginning. Right after the Chinese Grand Prix ended, the mood inside the paddock began to shift. At first, it was subtle. Small comments in interviews. Short answers from drivers. Engineers speaking quietly in team garages. But the message was becoming clearer with every passing hour. Something about these new cars was not working the way many drivers expected. The 2026 regulations introduced the biggest technical change Formula One has seen in years. New hybrid power units. New aerodynamic philosophy. And one revolutionary decision that completely changed how drivers attack a lap. The removal of DRS. For more than a decade, DRS had been the main overtaking tool in Formula One. Simple. Press a button. Open the rear wing. Gain speed on the straight. But the FIA wanted something more advanced. Something that looked less artificial. So they replaced that system with active aerodynamics. Now both the front wing and the rear wing constantly change configuration throughout the lap. On the straights, the wings open to reduce drag and increase top speed. In the corners, they close again to produce maximum downforce. In theory, this system should make the cars faster and allow drivers to follow each other more closely. But the Chinese Grand Prix revealed the hidden challenge behind this concept. The system only works perfectly when every part of the car is operating in perfect harmony. The aerodynamics, the hybrid power unit, the cooling systems, the electronic control software. Everything must be synchronized. If even one of those elements fails, the consequences can be immediate. That is exactly what happened in Shanghai. Max Verstappen was forced to retire after a failure in the energy recovery system, one of the most critical components of the new hybrid architecture. Fernando Alonso also retired after severe vibrations made the Aston Martin impossible to continue safely. And then came the moment that shocked everyone watching the race weekend. McLaren never even made it to the starting grid. Both Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri were eliminated before the race began due to electrical power unit problems. 2 cars. Out before the lights even went out. For a team expected to fight near the front, that is a massive warning sign. But the bigger concern was not just the retirements. It was what those failures revealed. These new cars operate within an extremely narrow performance window. When everything works perfectly, they are incredibly fast. But when something falls even slightly outside that window, the car becomes unstable. Drivers feel that instability immediately. The rear becomes nervous. The front loses grip. The balance changes from one corner to the next. And suddenly the driver is not racing the competition anymore. They are fighting the car. That is exactly the kind of situation that frustrates drivers like Max Verstappen. Because throughout his career, Verstappen has thrived in cars that allow him to attack aggressively. Cars that feel stable. Cars that respond instantly to every input. But if the car becomes unpredictable, confidence disappears. And in Formula One, confidence is everything. But here is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because while several teams were struggling to understand their cars in China, one team looked completely comfortable. Mercedes. Their car appeared stable from the very first lap to the very last. Smooth aerodynamic transitions, consistent energy deployment, and drivers who never seemed to be fighting the balance of the machine. That difference did not go unnoticed inside the paddock. Because when a new rulebook arrives in Formula One, one question always follows. Did one team solve the regulations faster than everyone else? If the answer is yes, the consequences can shape the entire championship. And after the chaos of the Chinese Grand Prix, that possibility is already making several teams very nervous. But the moment the race ended, one thing became impossible to ignore. The gap between teams looked enormous. Not just in speed, but in understanding. Because while several teams were fighting chaos, reliability problems, and unpredictable cars, one team looked completely in control. Mercedes. From the very first laps in Shanghai, their car behaved differently. Calm in the corners. Stable under braking. Smooth during the aerodynamic transitions that are causing serious headaches for other teams. That stability allowed Andrea Kimi Antonelli to drive with incredible confidence, securing the first Formula One victory of his career and leading a perfect 1-2 finish for Mercedes ahead of George Russell. For Mercedes, it was the ideal start to the new era. But for the rest of the grid, it raised a very uncomfortable question. What if Mercedes has already solved the biggest puzzle of the 2026 regulations? Because the real challenge of these new cars is not just speed. It is integration. The aerodynamics must work perfectly with the hybrid system. The hybrid system must deliver energy at exactly the right moment. The cooling systems must handle the extra electrical load. And the entire car must remain stable while the wings constantly change configuration during the lap. If one of those elements is slightly wrong, the car becomes unpredictable. If several are wrong at the same time, the car becomes almost impossible to drive at the limit. That is exactly what several teams appeared to experience in China. Red Bull lost Verstappen due to the ERS failure. Aston Martin lost Alonso because of severe vibrations. McLaren could not even start the race with either of their cars because of electrical problems. 3 completely different problems. But all connected by the same underlying reality. These cars are incredibly complicated. And when complexity increases, reliability becomes much harder to control. That is why engineers inside the paddock are already studying the regulations more carefully. They want to understand why some teams are struggling so much while others appear completely comfortable. Because if one team has already discovered the optimal concept for these regulations, catching up will not be easy. Development in Formula One is incredibly precise. A small aerodynamic change can affect cooling. Cooling changes can affect the hybrid system. Hybrid adjustments can influence energy deployment. And suddenly an upgrade designed to improve performance creates an entirely new problem somewhere else in the car. That is why the early phase of a new regulation era is so dangerous. Teams that start with unstable concepts spend months fixing problems. Meanwhile, teams with stable cars can focus purely on making them faster. That difference can quickly create a performance gap that becomes almost impossible to close. And this is exactly the scenario that makes drivers nervous. Because drivers feel these differences immediately. They feel it through the steering wheel, through the braking zones, through the way the car reacts when they push harder. If the car feels predictable, confidence grows. If the car feels fragile, confidence disappears. And that brings us back to Max Verstappen. Because Verstappen is known for one thing above all: aggressive precision. He attacks corners with absolute commitment. He expects the car to respond instantly. But if the car becomes unpredictable, that style becomes extremely difficult. And the early signs from Red Bull in China suggest that their car still has a very narrow operating window. Which means Verstappen may need to manage the car more carefully than he would like. For a driver with his racing instincts, that can be incredibly frustrating. But here is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because the drivers are not just reacting to one chaotic race. They are reacting to what these new rules might mean for the entire season. If the systems remain fragile. If reliability continues to be a problem. And if the performance gap between teams grows larger with every race. Then the debate around the 2026 regulations could become one of the biggest controversies in modern Formula One. And after what we witnessed in Shanghai, one thing is already clear. The new era of Formula One is not starting quietly. And this is exactly where the tension inside Formula One is starting to grow. Because the drivers are beginning to realize something that the fans are only starting to notice. These new cars demand a completely different style of driving. Not necessarily slower, but far more controlled. In previous generations, drivers could attack aggressively, pushing the limits of the car in every corner. They could rely on aerodynamic stability and mechanical grip. But the 2026 machines behave differently. The active aerodynamics constantly change the balance of the car. The hybrid system constantly changes how power is delivered. And the driver must adapt to those changes every single lap. That means managing energy carefully. choosing the right moment to deploy electrical power, preparing the car for aerodynamic mode changes before long straights, all while defending positions or attacking rivals. It is no longer just a test of speed. It is a test of management. And that is exactly what some drivers are starting to question. Because when too many systems influence performance, the driver can sometimes feel like they are no longer the main factor. Instead, the car becomes a complex machine controlled by software and energy management strategies. Some drivers enjoy that challenge. Others find it frustrating. And when frustrations begin to appear inside the cockpit, they often spread quickly across the grid. Because drivers talk to each other. They compare experiences. They discuss what the cars are doing during races. And if several drivers start feeling the same problems, the conversation eventually reaches the FIA. Right now, that conversation is still developing. But the Chinese Grand Prix may have been the first real warning sign. Not because the race itself was bad. In fact, there were moments of fantastic racing. Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc fought hard for the podium, showing that the new aerodynamic philosophy can allow drivers to follow each other closely for several laps. That is exactly what the FIA hoped to achieve. But the other side of the story cannot be ignored. Reliability problems. Complex systems failing. Teams struggling to understand the narrow operating windows of their cars. And drivers beginning to question how much technology is too much. If those concerns continue to grow, the pressure on the governing body will increase. Because Formula One is always a balance between engineering innovation and pure racing. Too much restriction, and teams complain about creativity being limited. Too much complexity, and drivers complain about losing control. The 2026 regulations are trying to walk that line. But the events in Shanghai suggest that the balance might be more fragile than expected. And the next races will reveal whether the Chinese Grand Prix was simply an early season learning curve, or the first signal that the new era of Formula One could become far more controversial than anyone predicted. Because if the chaos we saw in China continues to appear in the coming races, then the frustration of drivers like Max Verstappen might only be the beginning.